Nobody warns you about the quiet ones. Not the men who shout, not the ones who slam doors or raise fists or make threats that echo down hallways. Those men are frightening, yes, but they are frightening in a way the human brain already knows how to process. It is the quiet ones that unravel you. The ones who stand still, while the room does all the trembling for them. Chicago, Illinois, Satori Tower, the 42nd floor, 11 minutes past midnight. The rain outside was not falling. It was punishing, driving itself against the floor-to-ceiling glass with the kind of fury that made the whole city look like it was drowning in slow motion. Bianca Stewart's back was against the wall. Not figuratively, the way people say it when life gets difficult. Literally, physically, her shoulder blades pressed into cool mahogany paneling, while Leonardo Satori stood close enough that she could see the faint scar running along his jaw like a sentence someone had started and never finished. He was holding a glass of scotch the way other men hold power, loosely, carelessly, as though it had simply decided to belong to him and he had never questioned it. He had not touched her. He had not threatened her. He had simply looked at her, and somehow that was worse than both. The ice in his glass shifted, one slow, deliberate clink, and the sound cut through the silence of that office like a blade that had been waiting a long time to be used. Her dress was still damp from the rain, an emerald slip she had not chosen for herself, delivered to her apartment that morning in a flat black box with no card and no sender's name, as though whoever sent it already knew she would put it on without question. She had put it on. She was still annoyed about that. "You're not afraid of me," Leonardo said, and it was not a question. It was the quiet observation of a man who had studied her long enough to be surprised by something small. Bianca lifted her chin, because her knees were doing something completely unacceptable, and she needed at least one part of her body to hold its ground. "I'm terrified of you," she said clearly, because she had already decided that lying to this man was a short road with a very sudden ending. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, not anything she had a clean word for. "Good," he said softly, and took a slow sip without moving back a single inch. Outside, lightning cracked the Chicago skyline open, and in that half-second of white light flooding the office, Bianca saw something in his expression that no amount of practiced composure could completely bury. He was not deciding whether to ruin her. That decision had already been made. He was deciding something far more dangerous, and the part of her that had spent her whole life walking toward broken things instead of away from them already knew, before her brain could intervene, that she was going to let him. 48 hours before she found herself cornered in that penthouse, Bianca Stewart was standing on a ladder inside a building the city of Chicago had officially declared a lost cause. Which, if she was being honest with herself, made two of them. The Alderman Building on West Monroe Street was a 1920s commercial landmark that had survived two economic collapses, a fire on its third floor, and a full decade of bureaucratic neglect, only to meet its match in a property developer named Gerald Fitch, who wore Italian loafers and referred to architectural heritage as sentimental square footage. Bianca's firm was hired to assess whether the original terracotta facade could be preserved before the demolition permits cleared. She already knew they could. She also strongly suspected that Fitch had already paid someone at the city planning office to make sure those permits cleared ahead of schedule, because that was simply how Chicago worked, and pretending otherwise was a luxury she had exhausted along with most of her savings account. "The corbels on the east wall are still intact," she called down to Dominic, her one full-time employee, and on most days, her only reliable source of anything resembling optimism. "So we save the corbels and wave goodbye to the rest," he called back, his voice bouncing off bare concrete walls in a way that made the building sound even more hollow than it already was. "We are not waving goodbye to anything," she said, and climbed another rung. This was Bianca's defining flaw, visible to anyone who had known her longer than a week. She did not walk away from broken things. She walked straight toward them, pulled out her tools, and started identifying what could still be rescued. Whether it was a condemned building, a stalled legal case, or, as her college roommate once put it, men who look like a full renovation project but somehow keep getting a second showing. Sharp, that one. Not entirely wrong either, but Bianca had long since stopped taking decorating advice from a woman who once dated a man exclusively because he owned a boat. She was still on the ladder, photographing a section of original plasterwork, when her phone rang with a number she did not recognize. The voice on the other end was female, calm and precise in the specific way of someone paid generously to be all three at once. "Miss Stewart, you've been requested for a meeting at Satori Tower this evening at 11 o'clock. Bianca looked at her watch, then at the crumbling ceiling above her, then back at the phone. 11 at night, she said. Mr. Satori keeps his own schedule, the voice replied, in the tone of someone stating a law of nature rather than answering a question. She had heard the name Satori the way most people in Chicago had, in passing, in lowered voices, attached to words like acquisition and resolution, and occasionally to headlines that asked interesting questions and then quietly stopped asking them. Leonardo Satori was not a politician, not a developer, and not a lawyer in any way a law school would recognize, though he kept all three varieties on retainers that could comfortably fund a small nation. What he was exactly depended entirely on who you asked, how well you knew them, and whether there was anyone else in the room. Bianca assumed the meeting concerned the Alderman building, some new legal pressure point in Fitch's campaign, and spent the entire cab ride rehearsing her three strongest preservation arguments like a woman preparing for a zoning board hearing. She was not walking into a zoning board hearing. The lobby of Satori Tower at 11 on a Wednesday night was quieter than a confessional and considerably more unsettling, dark marble floors, recessed lighting that seemed engineered specifically to make you feel observed, and a security desk occupied by a man who looked like he had been assembled from components not available to the general public. He checked her name against a list, handed her a keycard without so much as a blink, and gestured toward a private elevator with the energy of someone who had done this many times before and had long since stopped finding any of it interesting. The elevator had no visible floor buttons, just a single illuminated panel that read 42, already selected, already waiting. It rose without stopping, smooth and certain, like it had somewhere to be and was not interested in detours. By the time the doors opened directly into Leonardo Satori's office, Bianca had mentally revised her talking points, reminded herself twice that she was a professional, and arrived at the quiet regret that she had worn heels on a night that might require a fast exit. Then she saw him. He was standing at the window with his back to her, watching the rain work over the city below with the stillness of a man who had made peace with everything he had ever done. Her carefully prepared arguments went silent, one by one, like lights being switched off down a corridor. He turned around. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they have already decided about, not studying, not wondering, simply confirming. "Sit down, Miss Stewart," he said, gesturing toward the chair across his desk with the same hand that held his drink. "I have been expecting you." She sat down. Every sensible instinct she had ever developed told her to stand back up. She stayed seated. That, in hindsight, was where it all truly began. The phone call had come first. That was the part Bianca kept turning over in her mind for the rest of that afternoon on the ladder. The voice, the precision of it, the way Mr. Satori keeps his own schedule had been delivered not as an explanation, but as a quiet instruction to adjust her expectations and stop asking follow-up questions. She had written the time on the back of a paint-chipped permit notice and tucked it into her coat pocket, telling herself it was probably nothing more than an aggressive legal maneuver dressed up in a very expensive building. Then the envelope arrived. It appeared on her apartment doormat at 4:30, which was suspicious enough on its own, because she had been inside the building since 3 and had not heard a single footstep in the hallway. 2 sharp knocks, clean, deliberate, the kind that did not wait for you to be ready, and then nothing but corridor silence. She opened the door to an empty hallway and a flat black envelope sitting on her mat with the patience of something that had never considered the possibility of being ignored. Her name was written across the front in ink, so precise it barely qualified as handwriting. Miss B. Stewart. No stamp, no return address, no postmark. Inside was a single card, heavy stock, the kind of paper that cost more per sheet than most people spent on a reasonable lunch. Satori Tower, 42nd floor, tonight, 11 o'clock, do not be late. No signature. She stood in her doorway for a long moment, holding the card in both hands, understanding without being told that the phone call had been a courtesy and the envelope was something else entirely. The envelope was a statement of intent. Dominic, when she called him, was quiet for 3 full seconds before he spoke. Bianca, he said carefully, in the particular tone he reserved for moments when he believed she was about to do something that he could not stop, but felt professionally obligated to object to anyway. People get phone calls from Satori's office. They do not generally get envelopes hand-delivered to their homes. Which means he wants me there, she said. Which means he already knows where you live, Dominic replied, and let that sit in the open air between them. She changed clothes twice before settling on the emerald dress she had set aside since the black box arrived that morning. A separate delivery she had not yet fully made peace with, but had chosen not to examine too closely, because some instincts were easier to follow than to explain. The cab ride to Satori Tower took 11 minutes through rain-slicked streets, and she spent every one of them mentally sorting through what she knew about the Alderman Building's legal standing, running through the Federal Preservation Clause she had unearthed from a 1987 city ordinance that Gerald Fitch's lawyers had apparently either missed or chosen to ignore. She was prepared for a legal conversation. She had documents. She had 3 solid arguments and a backup position, and the particular kind of quiet stubbornness that had kept her firm alive on a budget that any reasonable accountant would have described as aspirational at best. The lobby of Satori Tower at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night was the kind of space that did not try to intimidate you, which was precisely what made it so effective at doing exactly that. The security guard checked her name, handed over a keycard without a word, and gestured toward a private elevator with the ease of someone for whom this was simply a Wednesday. The elevator had no floor selection buttons visible, just a single illuminated panel already fixed on 42, already decided, already in motion the moment the doors closed behind her. It rose without stopping, smooth and unhurried, 42 floors of quiet ascent that gave her nothing to do but stand straight and breathe evenly and remind herself. She had walked into condemned buildings alone before and come out the other side with something worth saving. The doors opened. The office spread out before her, enormous, dim, the rain-battered city glowing through floor-to-ceiling glass on 3 sides like a painting that had not yet decided what it wanted to say. A decanter of scotch sat on the corner of a vast desk, catching what little light the room permitted, and there were books along one wall that had clearly been read rather than displayed, which told her something about him before he even turned around. He was standing at the window, his back to her, hands loosely clasped, watching the rain dismantle the skyline below with the absolute stillness of a man who had nothing left that the world could surprise him with. She had anticipated lawyers. A conference table, perhaps, stacked paper and hostile postures and men in suits who used polite language to conduct impolite business. There was only him. And a second glass, already poured on the edge of the desk closest to where she was standing. Bianca looked at it, then at the back of his head, then at the door behind her, doing the quiet mental arithmetic of someone who has just realized that the situation they walked into and the situation they prepared for are not the same situation at all. Leonardo Satori turned around. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they have already fully decided about, not assessing, not wondering, simply arriving at a conclusion he had reached some time before she had. And whatever argument she had rehearsed in that cab, Whatever careful, documented, legally sound position she had constructed across the entire afternoon, it went very quiet. Every single word of it. He did not say good evening. He did not offer his name, or his hand, or any of the small social courtesies that people exchange at the beginning of a conversation to signal that everyone in the room intends to behave themselves. He simply looked at her for a moment, the way you look at something you have been waiting on, and then he said, "The color suits you." Bianca blinked. Of all the sentences, she had braced herself for walking into this office. That particular one had not made the list. "I beg your pardon," she said. "The dress," Leonardo said, moving toward the desk with the same unhurried ease that seemed to be his only available setting. "Emerald, it suits you better than I expected." The room tilted, just slightly, on some internal axis she could not name. She looked down at the dress, the one from the flat black box with no card and no sender, and then back up at him, and watched him pick up his glass from the desk with the calm of a man who had just said something completely unremarkable. "That was you," she said, and it came out less like a question and more like a woman recalibrating everything she thought she understood about the last 12 hours. "You needed something appropriate for this building," he said simply, settling into the chair behind his desk and gesturing toward the one across from it. "What you were wearing on that ladder this afternoon would not have cleared the lobby." There were several things wrong with that sentence, and Bianca's mind lined them up with the instinctive precision of someone trained to identify structural faults before a building came down on top of her. He knew she had been on a ladder that afternoon. He knew what she had been wearing on it. He had sent the dress not as a gesture, but as a preparation, the way you lay out tools before a job you have already planned in full. She sat down because her legs suggested it, and she was not in a position to argue with them. "You've been watching me," she said, keeping her voice level with significant personal effort. "I've been thorough," he replied, as though that were a completely satisfying distinction, and opened a slim folder on the desk in front of him without any particular urgency. The office was quiet except for the rain, which had not relented even slightly, hammering the glass behind him with a persistence that was beginning to feel personal. Leonardo turned a single page in the folder, scanned it briefly, and then looked up at her with the expression of a man about to say something he has rehearsed not in the sense of being false, but in the sense of having decided exactly how much of the truth to use and in what order. "Your firm holds an outstanding debt of $240,000, he said, spread across 3 creditors, the largest of which called in an acceleration clause 4 weeks ago when your last deferral expired." Bianca said nothing. She knew the number, obviously. It lived in the back of her mind the way chronic pain lives in the body, always present, occasionally flaring into something she could not ignore. But hearing it spoken aloud in this office, in that voice, with that folder open on that desk, transformed it from a private burden into something that had been seen and measured and handled by someone else entirely. "You also have a lien on your family's estate in Evanston," he continued, "filed 6 months ago by the same creditor, who has since sold the note to a third party." He paused. "That third party is me," he said. The rain outside chose that precise moment to surge louder against the glass, which Bianca decided the universe owed her an apology for. "You own my debt," she said slowly, the words feeling strange and oversized in her mouth. "I own the instrument that holds your debt," he said, with the careful distinction of a man who was either a very good lawyer or had simply spent enough time around them to have absorbed the habit. "There is a technical difference." "Is there?" she said flatly. "Practically speaking," he tilted his head a fraction, "perhaps not." She looked at the glass of scotch he had poured for her, still sitting untouched at the edge of the desk, and made a private decision not to touch it, because accepting anything from this man, even something as small as a drink, already felt like agreeing to terms she had not yet read. "When did you buy it?" she asked. 3 weeks ago, he said. She counted backward in her head and arrived at the same week, She had received the final rejection letter from the city's Heritage Preservation Committee, the letter that had effectively closed the last clean exit from her financial situation and left her with a narrowing corridor of bad options. "You waited until I had nowhere else to go," she said. It was not an accusation, exactly, because an accusation implied she expected something better, and she was rapidly revising what she expected from this particular man. Leonardo did not deny it. He reached forward and closed the folder with the quiet finality of someone who had covered the necessary groundwork and was now prepared to move on to the actual conversation. "Your father built something worth protecting," he said, and something in his voice shifted, not softer exactly, but less constructed. "I intend to make sure it is protected." Bianca watched him carefully. "And what," she said, "do you intend to get out of it?" Leonardo picked up his glass, leaned back in his chair, and looked at her across the desk with an expression she could not fully decode. Something layered and deliberate, and older than the conversation they were currently having. "That," he said quietly, "is what the next chapter of this arrangement is for." The ice in his glass shifted once, with a sound like a clock marking something. And Bianca understood, with a clarity that arrived too late to be useful, that the dress had never been about the lobby. The contract appeared from a drawer. Not a filing cabinet, not a briefcase, not the hands of some waiting assistant who materialized from a side door, just a drawer on Leonardo's side of the desk, opened with the unhurried ease of a man retrieving something he had placed there well in advance of needing it. Which, Bianca was learning, was precisely how this man operated. He did not react to situations. He constructed them. The document was bound with a black clip and ran to what she estimated was 16 pages, which was somewhere between a standard employment agreement and a small country's constitution, and it landed on the desk in front of her with a soft, weighted certainty that she felt somewhere below her ribcage. "You prepared a contract," she said. "I prepare everything," he replied. She picked it up. The heading read, "Exclusive Consultancy Agreement, Satori Holdings Group." Her full name was already printed inside, correctly spelled, correctly formatted, positioned on the signature line with the quiet confidence of a document that had never seriously entertained the possibility of not being signed. "You want to hire me," she said, still reading. "I want to retain you," he said, which was a different thing, and they both understood why he had chosen that word specifically. She turned to page 3, because page 3 of any contract is where the language stops being welcoming and starts being honest. And what she found there was a compensation figure that made her stop reading for approximately 4 full seconds. It was not a generous offer. It was an obscene one, the kind of number attached to a job that either did not fully exist yet or came with conditions that the early pages had been carefully designed to make palatable before you arrived at them. "The scope of work," she said, finding the relevant section. "Architectural consultancy for the restoration and structural assessment of properties held under Satori Holdings." "Correct," he said. "And the duration of the contract is open-ended," she said, looking up from the page. "Until the work is complete," he said. "You haven't defined what complete means," she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. That same fractional acknowledgement she had already catalogued twice tonight, and was beginning to understand, was as close to impressed as this man allowed himself to appear. "Turn to page 9, he said. She did. Page 9 contained a single clause, set apart from the surrounding text by white space, in a way that suggested whoever drafted this document had been instructed to make sure it was seen clearly and not stumbled upon. It stated, in clean, precise language, that upon execution of the agreement, all outstanding debt instruments currently held by Satori Holdings against Bianca Claire Stewart and the Stewart family estate in Evanston, Illinois, would be transferred to a holding account and suspended for the full duration of her consultancy. Suspended. Not canceled. Not forgiven. Suspended, like a sword that had agreed, temporarily and conditionally, to stay where it was. She set the document down on the desk and looked at him. He looked back at her with the particular patience of someone who had calculated exactly how long this part would take. "If I stop working for you," she said, "the debt reactivates." "With the original terms intact," he confirmed. "And if I refuse to sign it tonight, then the primary creditor receives notification of my disinterest in the account first thing tomorrow morning," he said. "And you spend the remainder of the week explaining to a county court why the lien on your family home should not be exercised immediately." He said all of this without raising his voice, without altering his expression, without any of the theatrical menace that lesser men deployed when they wanted to communicate that they had won something. He simply stated it the way a civil engineer states load-bearing facts, not cruelly, just accurately, because accuracy was the point. Bianca picked up the document again, turned back to page 1, and read every single page. All 16 of them. It took her 22 minutes, and Leonardo did not rush her, did not check his watch, did not make a single sound beyond the occasional quiet shift of ice in his glass, which she was beginning to suspect he did deliberately, the way other people clear their throat. At the end of page 16, she set it down, and he slid a pen across the desk toward her without being asked. It was heavy, black, the kind of instrument that felt like a commitment in the hand before you had written a single letter with it. She signed. Her signature came out steady, which she considered a minor personal victory under the circumstances. She capped the pen and set it beside the document, and when she looked up, Leonardo had already risen from his chair and was rounding the desk toward her side with the quiet, measured movement that she was cataloging as his default mode of existing in physical space. He reached across and picked up the contract, reviewing her signature with a brief downward glance, and in doing so brought himself close enough that she caught the scent of him, cedar, scotch, and something underneath that had no clean name. She did not move. He straightened, and as he did, his thumb made contact with her lower lip. Not a stroke, not a deliberate caress, but a single brief point of contact, as though he had reached toward the page and the universe had shifted 2 inches and redirected him entirely. He stilled. She stilled. It lasted less than a second, and it rearranged something in the room that neither of them had the immediate vocabulary for. He stepped back, the contract in hand, his expression restored to its usual composed surface as though nothing had occurred that required acknowledgement. "Welcome to Satori Holdings, Miss Stewart," he said quietly. Bianca sat with her hands folded in her lap, her signature drying on 16 pages of a contract she had just signed in the middle of the night in a rain-battered penthouse, bound to a man she had known for less than an hour. She had walked in here to save a building. She was beginning to understand that the building was the least complicated thing in this room. She had not agreed to move in. That was the part worth clarifying, at least to herself, because the distinction between agreeing to something and simply failing to stop it from happening was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain in Leonardo Satori's orbit. The guest suite had been presented to her not as an offer, but as a logistical fact, somewhere between the signing of the contract and the quiet appearance of a woman named Carla, who introduced herself as the household manager with the brisk, pleasant efficiency of someone who had been briefed thoroughly and had no interest in the parts that were not her department. "Your things will be collected from your apartment in the morning," Carla had said, holding a folded towel in both hands like a small white flag of domesticity. "I haven't packed anything," Bianca had said. "That's quite all right," Carla had replied, with the tone of someone for whom this was not the first time this particular detail had come up. And that had been that. The guest suite occupied the building's northeast corner and was larger than Bianca's entire apartment by a measurement that she found privately embarrassing to calculate. The windows looked out over the city, the way expensive things always looked at lesser things, from a considerable and unapologetic height. The rain was still going, softer now, dragging itself down the glass in long, quiet lines that made the city lights below blur into something almost beautiful. Almost. She sat on the edge of the bed for a while without unpacking, mostly because she had nothing to unpack, and partly because sitting still felt like the only form of protest currently available to her. The room was tasteful in the specific way of spaces that have been designed by someone who understands comfort as a concept, but has never particularly needed it themselves. Everything was correct: the thread count, the lighting, the small carafe of water on the nightstand, and none of it felt like an accident. None of anything in this building felt like an accident. She lasted 40 minutes before she left the room. She told herself she was looking for the kitchen, which was partially true and mostly a story she was telling herself, because what she was actually doing was what she always did in an unfamiliar structure. She was mapping it, reading its bones, understanding its layout the way she understood every building she had ever worked in, by moving through it slowly and paying attention. The penthouse floor was a long, open configuration, with the private residence occupying the south and east wings, and Leonardo's office anchoring the north end, like the load-bearing wall of the entire operation. Between the two, running the full length of the western corridor, was a room she initially took for a library. It was not a library. The door was slightly ajar, which she would later decide was either an oversight or an invitation, and knowing what she now knew about this man, she leaned significantly toward the latter. She pushed it open. The room inside was long and narrow, lined on 3 sides with pinboards, mounted displays, and a continuous run of shelving that held labeled folders with the kind of meticulous organization that spoke of a mind that categorized everything it touched and trusted nothing to memory. Photographs, maps, property documents, corporate filings, pages of handwritten notes in a script so compact and controlled it looked like a language designed for one reader only. Strings of red thread connected points across a large city map mounted on the far wall, and beneath it, arranged in columns with the cold logic of a case file rather than the chaos of obsession, were names she did not recognize, names she half recognized from headlines, and one name, near the bottom left corner of the central board, that stopped her completely. Robert Stewart. Her father's name, printed on a manila folder, clipped behind a photograph she had never seen. Her father standing outside a building she did not immediately recognize, younger than she remembered him in her clearest memories, his hand extended toward someone whose face was cut out of frame. Her hand reached for it before she had consciously decided to move. That section of the room is not part of your consultancy brief. She spun around. Leonardo was standing in the doorway, his jacket gone, his collar open at the throat, holding a glass that she suspected had been refilled at least once since she had last seen him. He did not look angry. He did not look surprised. He looked like a man who had calculated the exact probability of this moment occurring and had decided to let it happen rather than prevent it. "You have a file on my father," she said, because there was genuinely no diplomatic way to open that conversation. "I have files on many people," he said, stepping into the room with the measured calm of someone reclaiming space without making a performance of it. "That is not an answer," she said. "No," he agreed, stopping beside her and looking at the board with an expression she could not read from her angle. "It isn't." He reached past her and pressed the folder flat against the board, not removing it, not concealing it, simply stilling it, and the motion brought him close enough that she felt the warmth of him at her shoulder. "Your father was a man who made a significant decision on a significant night," he said quietly, his eyes still on the board, "and I have spent 11 years making sure that decision was not wasted." Bianca looked at the photograph, at her father's outstretched hand, at the figure whose face had been deliberately removed from the frame, and understood with a slow, cold certainty exactly whose face was missing. "He saved your life," she said. Leonardo said nothing. Which, she was learning, was the closest he ever came to saying yes. 3 days into her employment, Bianca had developed a working theory about Leonardo Satori. He was not a man who lived in his building so much as a man who had built a fortress around his routine and called it a home, and the two things were different enough that she noticed the distinction without being entirely sure what to do with it. He arrived at his desk by 6 each morning, which she knew because she had made the mistake of getting up early on her second day to establish some semblance of her own schedule, and had found him already there, already working, already on his second cup of coffee, looking at her appearance in the kitchen doorway with the mild expression of someone who had expected her approximately 4 minutes earlier. He was in meetings for most of the day, phone calls conducted in low, measured tones behind a closed office door, visits from men who arrived in good suits and left looking like they had been quietly reorganized from the inside. He did not explain his business to her, and she did not ask, because page 11 of the contract had contained a confidentiality clause extensive enough to paper 3 walls. What he did do was leave architectural briefs on her desk each morning, property files, structural assessments, restoration proposals for buildings held under the Satori Holdings portfolio, and review her findings each evening with the focused, unhurried attention of a man who took the work seriously, even when she suspected the work was partly a mechanism for keeping her occupied and close. She took it seriously, too, because the buildings were real and the problems in them were real, and that, at least, was ground she understood. It was on the 3rd evening, while Leonardo was at a meeting across the city, that the penthouse went wrong. She was alone in the study off the main corridor, cross-referencing a set of original blueprints for a 1930s warehouse property in Pilsen against a more recent structural survey, when she heard it, a sound from the direction of Leonardo's office that did not belong to the building's usual vocabulary of creaks and rainfall and distant elevator mechanics. It was a footstep, deliberate and careful in the specific way of someone attempting not to make one. Bianca set her pencil down slowly. The study door was open 6 inches, and through the gap she could see a narrow slice of the corridor leading toward the office. And what she saw moving through that corridor was not Carla, not any of the building's security staff she had been introduced to, and not anyone whose presence on the 42nd floor had a clean explanation. He was broad, unhurried, dressed in dark clothing with the practiced nonchalance of someone who had done this before and found it largely administrative, and he was heading directly for Leonardo's office with a small device in his right hand that she did not recognize but instinctively did not want to. She did not move. She controlled her breathing the way she had learned to control it in unstable buildings, slowly, through the nose, giving nothing away to the air around her. Her phone was on the desk beside the blueprints, and she picked it up with the deliberate stillness of someone diffusing something fragile, opened the recent calls, and pressed Leonardo's name. He answered on the 2nd ring. "There is someone in your office," she said, barely above a whisper. "He came in from the corridor. He has something in his hand." There was a silence of approximately 1 second. "Do not move from where you are," Leonardo said. And the change in his voice was not dramatic. It did not rise or sharpen or acquire any of the theatrical urgency she might have expected, but something in it compressed, tightened, became a different instrument entirely. "Do not let him hear you. I am 4 minutes away." He was there in 3. She heard the elevator before she heard anything else, and then she heard things she did not have precise words for, the office door opening with controlled force. A short exchange of sounds that lasted less than a minute and contained nothing she wanted to reconstruct clearly in her mind afterward. Then silence. Then Leonardo's voice, even in quiet from the corridor. "Bianca." She came out of the study on legs that were performing adequately, but had filed a formal complaint about the evening. The man in dark clothing was no longer standing. He was seated against the corridor wall in a posture that suggested the choice had not been entirely his wrist held at an angle that made her wince on pure architectural sympathy, and Leonardo was crouched in front of him with one forearm braced across his collarbone and the expression of a man conducting a professional inquiry through unconventional means. She looked at Leonardo's hands, at the controlled, absolute economy of the way he held the other man in place, and understood in that moment, fully, without any remaining ambiguity, exactly what kind of work this man had done before he had started giving her blueprint briefs to review. Security arrived from the floors below within minutes, and the man was removed with a brisk efficiency that suggested this particular contingency had a procedure, and the procedure was well rehearsed. Leonardo straightened, adjusted his cuff, and turned to look at her. She was sitting on the corridor floor. She had not made a conscious decision to sit on the corridor floor. Her legs had simply concluded their shift without giving notice. He crossed to her without a word and lowered himself to one knee in front of her, which brought his face level with hers for the first time since she had met him. And at this proximity, the composed, unreadable surface of him was close enough that she could see past it, just slightly, to something that was working very hard underneath. He reached out and pressed 2 fingers to the inside of her wrist, not romantically, practically, checking her pulse with the focused attention of someone taking a reading. "Elevated," he said quietly, "but steady." "Thank you for that medical update," she said, and her voice only fractured on the last word, which she considered acceptable given the circumstances. Something crossed his face that was not quite a smile, and not quite the other thing either, but lived in the territory between them. He sat beside her on the corridor floor, his back against the wall, his long legs extended in front of him, and did not tell her to get up or move to a chair or compose herself, which was the most unexpectedly human thing he had done since she had arrived. They sat like that for a while, the rain still working at the windows at the end of the hall, the city glowing its indifferent glow 42 floors below. "He was looking for something," she said eventually. "Yes," Leonardo said. "Did he find it?" "No," he said. "He found me instead." She looked at his hands resting on his knees, steady and completely still, and thought about what those hands had looked like 60 seconds ago, and felt the strange, complicated vertigo of being simultaneously grateful for and unsettled by the exact same thing. "Who sent him?" she asked. Leonardo was quiet for a moment that had some weight to it. "Someone who has noticed," he said carefully, "that my habits have changed recently." Bianca looked at him. He did not look back at her, but the line of his jaw shifted in a way she was beginning to recognize as Leonardo Satori saying something he had not fully intended to say, and knowing it, and declining to take it back. She did not ask him to explain it. She already understood more than was probably safe. The invitation had not been extended, so much as announced. Leonardo had set a flat cream envelope on her desk on Thursday morning, beside her coffee and her blueprint briefs, without comment, and walked back to his office as though the matter was already settled, which, she was learning, was his preferred method of making decisions that technically involved other people. Inside was an embossed card for the Hargrove Foundation annual gala, the following Saturday, black tie, at the Chicago Cultural Center. An event she recognized from the society pages of publications she read primarily for their architectural photography and largely ignored for everything else. She appeared in his office doorway, with the card held at shoulder height. "I wasn't consulted," she said. "You weren't required to be," he said, without looking up from the document he was reading. She stood there for a moment, assembling a response with the focused patience of a woman laying load-bearing beams. "I don't have anything to wear to a black tie event," she said, which was the most practical objection available, and therefore the one most likely to produce a concrete conversation. Leonardo looked up. "You will," he said simply, and returned to his document. The garment arrived the following afternoon in a long black case, delivered by a woman from a boutique, whose name Bianca did not recognize, but whose manner suggested she was not accustomed to destinations below the 30th floor. It was a dark navy gown, structured at the shoulder and fluid everywhere else, the kind of dress designed by someone who understood that the most powerful thing a garment could do was make the person wearing it feel like they had always been capable of walking into any room. Bianca tried it on, looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment, and was privately annoyed at how well he had judged it. The Chicago Cultural Center on a gala evening was the architectural equivalent of a standing ovation. The Washington Street entrance lit warmly against the winter dark, the interior's ornate mosaic ceilings doing what they had been doing since 1897, which was making every event held beneath them feel marginally more significant than it actually was. Bianca knew the building. She had written a paper on its Preston Bradley Hall dome during her 3rd year of graduate school, which meant she spent the first 4 minutes of their arrival cataloging the restoration work on the South Corridor tilework, while Leonardo stood beside her with his hand resting at the small of her back and the patient expression of a man who had anticipated this detour and factored it into his timeline. "The grout on the East Arcade is newer than the rest," she said quietly. "Mid-90s restoration," he said, without hesitation. She glanced at him. "You know the building," she said. "I funded part of the restoration," he said, guiding her forward with the lightest directional pressure at her back. "The grout was a compromise I was not entirely satisfied with." She filed that away beside everything else she was accumulating about him. The books that had been read, the files that had been maintained, the 11 years of a debt he had kept without ever being asked to. The Gala itself was exactly what she expected from a room full of people whose net worth required professional management. Beautiful in the expensive, effortful way of things that look effortless only because the effort has been entirely outsourced, and buzzing with the particular energy of a social environment where every conversation is also a negotiation, and every introduction is also a calculation. Leonardo moved through it with the ease of a man who had long since stopped being impressed by rooms like this and attended them purely as a function of something other than enjoyment. His hand did not leave her back. Not when he greeted a silver-haired man named Aldrich Voss with the measured warmth of a long professional acquaintance and introduced her as his senior architectural consultant, a title that appeared on page 1 of her contract and felt, in this context, like a very well-tailored piece of armor. Not when a woman in a red gown attached herself to their orbit with the focused social momentum of someone who had identified Leonardo as the most significant person in the room and had decided, within seconds of registering Bianca's presence, to treat her as a navigational obstacle rather than a person. Leonardo's hand at her back applied the faintest increase of pressure, not possessive, not theatrical, simply present, in the specific way of someone communicating something to a room without making a sound, and the woman recalibrated her trajectory within 30 seconds. "You do that on purpose," Bianca said quietly when they had moved on. "Do what?" he said. "The hand," she said. "You're telling people something." He looked down at her with an expression that sat somewhere between acknowledgement and the complete absence of apology. "This room contains 3 people who would find you considerably more interesting if they knew you were unattached," he said evenly. "I am simplifying the evening." "For whose benefit?" she asked. He did not answer, which was itself an answer, and they both understood that. What she noticed, and filed away with the same careful attention she gave to structural details that did not yet have an obvious explanation, was that his hand was not the performative gesture of a man managing appearances. It was steadier than that. It was the hand of someone who had placed it there, and then, somewhere in the space between the first hour and the second, had stopped thinking about why. Near the end of the evening, they stood at the edge of the room near the South Corridor, the mosaic arches rising above them in their restored, compromised glory, and a man Bianca did not recognize approached from across the floor with the particular trajectory of someone who had been working up to it for a while. He was well-dressed, handsome in a calculated way, and he looked at Bianca first and Leonardo second, which was either brave or uninformed. He extended his hand toward her. "I don't believe we've met," he said, with the smooth opener of someone accustomed to that line working. Leonardo's hand, still at the small of her back, did not move. But something in the temperature of it changed. "We haven't," Bianca said. The man smiled and opened his mouth to continue, and Leonardo said, quietly, without heat, without any performance of dominance whatsoever, "Dorian." Just the name. The man called Dorian looked at Leonardo for one long moment, and whatever he found there rearranged his intentions entirely. "Leonardo," he said, with a nod that contained several things Bianca could not fully translate. "Enjoy your evening." He left. Bianca watched him go and then looked up at Leonardo, who was already looking down at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, not the composed surface, not the fractional almost smile, but something quieter and considerably less managed. "Who was that?" she asked. "Someone," Leonardo said carefully, who needed to understand something clearly. His hand remained where it was for the rest of the evening. And the part of her that had spent her entire life identifying which walls in a building were structural and which ones were merely decorative was beginning to run that same assessment on herself, and arriving at conclusions she was not yet ready to say out loud. She found out on a Tuesday. In hindsight, it was the kind of discovery that had probably always been there, waiting at the edge of her understanding like a structural fault she had been circling without quite looking at directly. And the only reason it took her this long was that she now understood, deliberately given other things to look at. It started with a phone call from a former colleague named Priya, who ran a mid-sized restoration practice in River North, and had, 4 months ago, offered Bianca a senior partnership position that would have resolved most of her financial situation and kept her out of any penthouse on any floor of any building in this city. Bianca had turned it down. She had turned it down because 3 days before she was due to sign the offer letter, Priya had called to say the partnership funding had been unexpectedly withdrawn by their primary investor, and the position no longer existed in the form it had been offered, and she was sorry, and perhaps they could revisit in a year when the practice had stabilized. Bianca had accepted this with the quiet resignation of someone who had grown accustomed to doors closing at inconvenient moments, and had thought nothing more of it. "The investor came back," Priya said on the phone, sounding equal parts relieved and puzzled. "Reinstated the full funding this morning out of nowhere with a written apology for the disruption. 7 months later, no explanation." Bianca was standing at the window of the study, looking out at the city below. "That's good news," she said carefully. "It is," Priya said. "Although our compliance team ran the investor's corporate structure this morning, just to be thorough before we re-engaged, and the parent holding company is Bianca, it's Satori Holdings." The city outside the window continued its business 42 floors below, entirely indifferent. "The same company withdrew the funding as well," Priya continued, gently, the way people deliver information they suspect will cause damage. 7 months ago, 3 days before your offer letter was due." Bianca said something appropriate and ended the call. She stood at the window for a while without moving. Then she went to her desk and opened her laptop and spent the next 90 minutes doing what she did with every structural problem she encountered. She mapped it, traced it back to its foundation, followed the load-bearing lines to their source. The Priya partnership was not the only one. The heritage grant she had lost in February, the one that had been pulled by its issuing foundation 2 weeks before the decision was due, was administered by a board that included 2 directors she could now trace, through a sequence of corporate connections that were not hidden so much as simply not signposted, to Satori Holdings. The city planning consultant who had stopped returning her calls about the Alderman building in January, effectively stalling her preservation case until Fitch's demolition permits cleared. He had been retained, on a separate matter, by a firm that shared an address with one of Leonardo's subsidiary companies. She sat back in her chair and looked at what she had assembled on the screen. He had not simply waited until she had nowhere to go. He had been, with quiet and systematic patience, making sure that the places she might have gone were no longer available. She closed the laptop. She picked up her coat. She did not take the elevator. She took the emergency stairwell because it was direct, and because she needed 42 floors of something physical to do with what was currently moving through her chest. And she came out through the building's side entrance into a Chicago evening that had been threatening rain since mid-afternoon and had now decided to make good on it. She walked. She had no particular destination. She was now acutely aware, no apartment to return to, no job offer waiting, no financial position that existed independently of the man she was currently walking away from, but the walking felt necessary, the most honest thing available to her in that moment, and she stayed with it. She had made it 4 blocks when she heard him. Bianca. She kept walking. Bianca. She stopped. Not because the word compelled her. She had stopped because something in the register of it did. Some quality underneath the syllables that she had not heard from him before, rougher than his usual delivery, less constructed, as though the composure he wore as a matter of professional habit had developed a fault line somewhere between his office and this pavement. She turned around. He was standing 6 feet behind her in the rain, without an umbrella, his jacket darkening at the shoulders, looking at her with an expression that was the most unguarded thing she had seen on his face since the corridor floor after the breach. "You knew about Priya's partnership," she said. "Yes," he said. She appreciated that he did not dress it differently. "The heritage grant," she said. "Yes." "The planning consultant." "Yes." The rain came down between them, with no interest in the conversation. "You built the cage before you put me in it," she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt, which she credited to 11 years of professional training in environments where losing composure had structural consequences. "I did," he said. "Why?" she said, and the word came out with more raw material in it than she had intended. Leonardo took 2 steps toward her and stopped, as though he had measured the distance and decided that was as close as he was entitled to come given the current terms of things. "Because I sat across from you for 4 minutes in that office," he said, "and understood something I had no framework for." The rain pressed harder. "That is not a justification," she said. "No," he agreed, "it isn't." He looked at her for a long moment, the water running down his jaw, his collar soaked through, every external marker of the controlled and immovable man she had spent 6 weeks cataloging stripped back by the weather to something considerably more honest underneath. "I have run this organization for 14 years, he said, without a single decision that was not fully calculated, without a single variable I had not accounted for in advance. He paused. "You are the first thing in 14 years that I cannot account for," he said, "and I handled that the only way I know how to handle things that I cannot afford to lose." Bianca looked at him standing in the rain, this man who controlled half the city from a room on the 42nd floor, and had apparently spent 7 months quietly dismantling her options one by one, with the focused precision of someone who had decided the outcome before the game had started, and felt, with deeply inconvenient clarity, 2 completely contradictory things at exactly the same time. She was furious. She was also, underneath the fury, in the place she did not yet have a clean name for, something else entirely. "You can't do that," she said. "You cannot just arrange people." "I know," he said. "I am not one of your properties," she said. "I know that too," he said quietly. "I knew it when I did it." The rain filled the silence between them, with everything they were not yet saying. "Then why?" she said. "Are you telling me this now instead of just letting me walk?" Leonardo looked at her, water-soaked and unguarded and more present in that moment than she had ever seen him in 6 weeks of proximity. "Because," he said, with the careful delivery of a man choosing the most honest words available to him, "I find that I cannot breathe correctly when you are not somewhere within my line of sight." He said it the way he said everything, quietly, without decoration, as a plain and inconvenient fact. "And the idea of you walking away from this building," he continued, "and not coming back, is the first thing in 14 years that I do not know how to absorb." The city moved around them, indifferent and rain-soaked, and entirely unaware that something was shifting on this particular pavement between these 2 particular people. Bianca stood in the rain and looked at the man who had caged her, and was now standing in front of her without a single wall left, asking her, in the only language he apparently possessed, to stay. She did not say yes. She did not say no. She turned around and walked back toward the building, and she did not look behind her to see if he was following, because she already knew that he was, and she already knew what that meant, and she needed at least one more block of rain and cold air before she was ready to deal with what she knew. They did not speak about the rain. Not that evening when they returned to the building in silence, not the following morning over coffee, not across the desk during the 2 days that followed, which resumed their surface structure of blueprint briefs and evening reviews, as though the pavement conversation had been filed somewhere between them under a category that neither was ready to open yet. But something had shifted in the architecture of things. Not dramatically, nothing between them had ever moved dramatically, but in the way a building shifts after settlement, small and structural and permanent, detectable only to someone who knew how to read the signs. She stayed. That was the shift. She had walked back through the building's side entrance with the rain still in her hair, and Carla had wordlessly handed her a towel, and that had been the entirety of the conversation about whether she was leaving. She was not leaving. She had not decided why yet, and she gave herself permission to leave that particular question in the unresolved column for now, because some structural assessments required more time than the immediate moment allowed. It was on the third night, after the rain, that the building's power went out. She was in the study at 11:40 when it happened. Not a gradual dimming, but an immediate, total subtraction of light, the kind that arrives with intent rather than accident, the whole floor going dark simultaneously in a way that the building's standard fail-safe protocols should have prevented within 4 seconds. The backup generators did not engage. That was the first signal that this was not a power fault. Bianca sat completely still in the sudden dark and did what she had learned to do in unstable structures. She stopped, she listened, and she let her eyes adjust before she moved anything else. She could hear the building. This was not a skill she had ever thought to put on a professional resume, but 11 years of working inside structures that other people had given up on had given her an acute sensitivity to the sounds a building made when something was wrong with it. And what she was hearing now in the walls and the elevator shaft and the stairwell access at the corridor's end was not the sound of a power fault. It was the sound of people moving through a building who did not want to be heard moving through it. Her phone had no signal. She checked twice, then set it face down on the desk so the screen cast nothing. She thought about Chapter 5, and the man in the corridor and Leonardo saying someone who has noticed that my habits have changed, and she understood with the cold clarity of a person whose professional life had trained her to assess threats to structures, that whatever was happening on the floors below was not random and was not small. She needed to find Leonardo. She needed to do it in the dark, in a building she had been living in for 6 weeks, against people who had cut the power specifically because darkness was their advantage. The problem with that calculation was that darkness had never particularly frightened Bianca Stewart. She knew this building. She had mapped it, the way she mapped every building she inhabited, out of professional habit and personal instinct, the load-bearing walls, the corridor widths, the exact location of every door and junction and access point on the residential floor, committed to memory the way other people memorized routes they drove every day without thinking. She knew that the main corridor ran 38 feet from the study doorway to the turn toward Leonardo's office, with a service alcove at the 22-foot mark on the left side that most people who had not specifically looked for it would walk directly into. She knew the office's north wall had a secondary access panel. She had noted it during her first week when she was reviewing the building's original construction documents and had found the floor plan annotation for what the 1987 renovation had covered over but not removed. She knew the eastern stairwell had a landing irregularity at the 39th floor that would cause anyone unfamiliar with it to lose half a second of footing in the dark. Half a second, in the kind of situation currently developing on this floor, was a meaningful unit of time. She moved out of the study low and quiet, her right hand trailing the wall at shoulder height, counting her steps with the practiced automatic focus of someone who had navigated condemned floors where a misplaced foot had genuine consequences. 22 feet. She felt the alcove edge before she reached it, Adjusted, continued. 30 feet. The turn. She could hear them now more clearly. 2 sets of movement, possibly 3, coming from the direction of the elevator lobby. The kind of careful, coordinated advance that suggested people who had done this before and had a floor plan, or believed they did. Their floor plan, she was fairly certain, did not include the secondary access panel in the north wall. She found Leonardo by following the one sound she had learned in 6 weeks to identify in any room. The specific quality of a stillness that was not passive but ready. The silence of a man who had heard what she had heard and was already ahead of it. He was at the office's north wall when she found him, and the fact that he did not reach for her as a threat when she came through the service corridor told her his eyes had adjusted better than most. There are at least 2 on the floor, she breathed, barely sound at all. 3, he said at the same volume. 1 held at the elevator. The north panel, she said. A pause of 1 second. Show me, he said. She found his wrist in the dark, and that was the entirety of the deliberation. Her hand on his wrist. His immediate stillness as he transferred navigation entirely to her without question or negotiation. The clean trust of a man who understood when another person's expertise outranked his own. She moved and he followed, and she guided him through the dark with the same quiet authority she used on construction sites when the lighting failed, and the crew needed someone who had memorized the floor before the scaffolding went up. The north panel opened inward on a service corridor that ran behind the office's structural wall and fed into a secondary stairwell that the building's current security system, she had noted with mild professional criticism, had never been adequately integrated with. She heard the men enter the office behind them as the panel closed. She heard them searching. And then she heard the particular quality of confusion that moves through a group of people when the person they came for is simply not in the room they were certain he would be in. In the stairwell, Leonardo's phone connected. A different signal band, she noted, a separate line she had not known about, which added another folder to her mental wall of things about this man that she was still in the process of understanding. He said 4 words into the phone. 42nd, North Stairwell. His security team arrived from the floors below in under 3 minutes, and the sounds that followed from the office and the corridor were brief and definitive, and she chose to focus on the stairwell wall in front of her, and the way the emergency strip lighting at the base of each step cast the concrete in a pale, specific amber that reminded her of a building she had once restored in the South Loop. She was thinking about that building with considerable focus when Leonardo turned to look at her in the half-dark. She could see him clearly enough. "The panel," he said. "You found that in the construction documents." "First week," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You mapped the entire floor," he said. "I map every building I'm in," she said. "It's a professional habit." "It saved our lives tonight," he said, without drama, as a plain assessment of the situation. "It saved your life," she said. "I was mostly saving myself and you happened to be in the same building." That fractional thing happened at the corner of his mouth. And then, in the amber-lit stairwell with his security team working the floor above them, Leonardo Satori reached out and pressed his hand flat against the concrete wall beside her head, not trapping her. The geometry was completely different from that first night against the mahogany, and they both felt the difference, but steadying himself, or steadying something, in a way that was entirely unperformed. "Bianca," he said. "I know," she said. Neither of them said anything else. The building hummed around them, its bones and its secrets and its 38 feet of corridor that she knew better than the men who had come to use the dark against it. And somewhere above them, the situation was being resolved with the efficient finality that Leonardo's world applied to problems that had made the mistake of becoming problems. She had walked into this building 6 weeks ago to save a terracotta facade. She had ended up saving something considerably more complicated. The office looked like an argument that had been settled by force. One of the reading chairs had been displaced from its position near the bookshelf, and a lamp was down on its side against the far wall, still on, throwing a long triangle of amber light across the floor at an angle that made the room feel tilted, even though nothing structural had been compromised. The desk was intact. The decanter, she noted, had survived. Bianca stood in the doorway and took a slow inventory of the space the way she always assessed a building after a significant event, systematically, starting from the perimeter and working inward, looking for what held and what hadn't. The room had held. Leonardo had not, entirely. She saw it when Carla intercepted him near the corridor entrance with the brisk, practiced efficiency of a woman who had clearly provided this particular service before. A folded cloth pressed to his left side, just below the ribs, with quiet urgency and zero visible alarm, which told Bianca that the lack of alarm was itself a trained response and not an accurate reflection of the situation. "You were hit," Bianca said. "Grazed," he said, in the tone of a man making a technical distinction he considered important. "Those are not the same thing," she said, crossing the room toward him. "They are closer than the alternative," he said, which was so unreasonably logical under the circumstances that she chose not to respond to it and focused instead on the cloth Carla was holding in place, which had moved past the point of being described as minor. Carla looked at her with the measured expression of a woman, silently communicating the full weight of the situation across a room, while maintaining professional composure for the benefit of the man currently insisting he was fine. Bianca understood the look completely. "Sit down," she said to Leonardo. He looked at her. "I am perfectly." "Sit down," she said again, with the quiet, load-bearing firmness she used on contractors who had convinced themselves that a compromised foundation was a manageable inconvenience. He sat. Whether because she had compelled him, or because the alternative had become more complicated than he wanted to manage, she could not say with certainty, and she chose not to examine the distinction too closely. The wound was real but not catastrophic. A grazing trajectory along the lateral ribcage that had taken skin and surface tissue and delivered a significant quantity of blood, but had not gone deeper, which Bianca confirmed not through any medical training, but through the specific relief on Carla's face when she cleaned and assessed it with the supplies from a kit that lived, revealingly, in the third drawer of the office's side cabinet. Third drawer. Prepositioned. She filed that beside everything else. Carla finished, wrapped it cleanly, gave Leonardo a look that contained a complete medical advisory and one personal opinion, and left them alone with the tact of someone who understood that the room needed to be smaller for whatever came next. The city outside had cleared. The rain was finally done, and Chicago at 2 in the morning without weather was a different thing entirely. Quieter, more honest. The lights simply lights rather than reflections, the skyline sitting in its own dark with the uncomplicated confidence of something that had been there long before tonight's events and would remain long after. Leonardo sat in the chair behind his desk, his shirt replaced with a clean one Carla had provided, his jacket gone, the Scotch decanter within reach and a glass already poured with the careful, one-handed deliberateness of a man working around a newly complicated left side. He had not poured a second glass. Bianca stood at the window for a while with her back to him, looking at the city, doing the quiet internal accounting that the last several hours required. She thought about the envelope on the doormat. She thought about the contract and the 16 pages and the thumb against her lower lip and the corridor floor after the first breach. She thought about the rain on his shoulders on that pavement 4 blocks from this building, and the way he had said, "I find that I cannot breathe correctly when you are not somewhere within my line of sight," with the plain, reluctant honesty of a man reporting a condition he had not chosen and could not resolve. She thought about the dark stairwell and her hand on his wrist, and the way he had followed her through the building he owned, in the dark, without question, because she knew it better than he did, and he had understood that immediately and simply let it be true. She thought about what it meant that she had not once, in the 3 minutes it had taken his security team to arrive, considered that Leonardo Satori might not be worth the architecture lesson. She turned around. He was watching her from the desk with the glass in his right hand and the particular stillness of a man who has decided not to speak because the room is in the middle of deciding something, and he knows better than to interrupt it. She crossed the room. Not quickly, there was nothing hurried about any of it, no cinematic momentum, no dramatic crossing of distances. Just Bianca Stewart walking across an office she had mapped in her first week, past the bookshelf with its read and annotated volumes, past the side cabinet with its third-drawer field kit, past the displaced chair that she straightened without thinking as she passed it, because straightening things that had been knocked out of alignment was simply what she did. She stopped at the desk. She looked at him, at the composed and fractured and quietly extraordinary difficulty of him, at the man who had built a cage around her with one hand and stood in the rain without a single wall left with the other, and she reached out and took the glass from his hand. Not dramatically, not as a declaration. Simply took it, the way you take something from someone when you have decided, without ceremony or announcement, that you are staying. He let her take it. She held it for a moment, looking at the amber depth of it, and then set it on the desk between them where it was neither hers nor his, but occupied the space that everything between them had been slowly moving toward since the night she had walked out of an elevator into a dark room and found a man at a window who had already decided about her. "I'm not leaving," she said. It was not a concession. It was not forgiveness or agreement or the resolution of any of the complicated and unfinished things still sitting in the space between them, because those things would take considerably longer than one night in a blood-stained office to work through. And she knew that, and he knew that, and neither of them was pretending otherwise. It was simply the truth, stated in the plainest available language, by a woman who had spent her entire professional life walking toward broken things and staying, until she understood what could be saved. Leonardo looked at her across the desk, the glass between them, the city quiet behind her for the first time since she had arrived in this building. Something in his face moved, not the fractional corner of the mouth, not the composed surface adjusting for a reaction it had permitted itself, but something deeper and less managed, a shift in the foundation rather than the facade, the kind of movement that a building makes not when it is under stress, but when something that has been holding it rigid for a very long time finally releases its tension. He reached forward and picked up the glass from the space between them. He held it for a moment, and then he held it out toward her, not taking it back, offering it, which was a different gesture entirely, an older and more honest one, the gesture of someone extending the one thing they have learned, slowly and at considerable cost, to share. She took it. She sat in the chair across from him, the way she had sat on the very first night, in the emerald dress with her preservation arguments dissolving one by one in the silence of a room that had already made up its mind about her. Only now the silence was different. It was the silence of a building after the work is done, not empty, not waiting, but settled, the particular quiet of a structure that has found the equilibrium it was designed for and is simply, finally, at rest in it. Outside, Chicago held its breath in the small hours before dawn, and on the 42nd floor of Satori Tower, in an office that had seen the full measure of this night's damage, two people sat across a desk with one glass between them and did not say anything else. Because some things, once they have been decided, do not require any further words. And Bianca Stewart had always known, better than most, that the most important moment in any restoration was not the discovery of the damage, and not the long work of repair. It was the moment you looked at what you had chosen to stay for, and understood, without any remaining doubt, that it had been worth it.